The bullets stopped at 4:17 a.m. In the sudden silence that followed, 53 people breathed in the acrid smoke of a burning checkpoint, their lives intact because one woman had chosen duty over reputation, sacrifice over survival. But 12 hours earlier, that same woman had been branded a traitor by the very people she would die protecting. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning briefing room at Forward Operating Base Meridian buzzed with the controlled chaos of a unit preparing for extraction. Maps covered every available surface, their edges weighted down with coffee cups and tactical radios. Outside, the desert sun had already begun its daily assault on the compound, turning the corrugated metal walls into radiators that would cook anyone foolish enough to touch them by noon. Diana Crawford sat 3 rows from the front, her notepad balanced on her knee, pen moving steadily across the page, while the other intelligence analysts clustered around the main display screen. She worked from memory, sketching the valley approach routes she had studied for the past 18 months. Every ridge line, every possible sniper position, every civilian shelter in the villages below, she knew them all by heart. Her uniform was standard issue, no different from the others in the room, but it hung differently on her frame. Where others wore their gear like armor, she wore hers like work clothes. Her boots were scuffed from countless patrols through the base perimeter, gathering intelligence that rarely made it into the official reports. Her sleeve pocket bulged slightly with the small notebook she always carried, filled with observations about local movement patterns, tribal dynamics, and the subtle shifts in civilian behavior that preceded trouble. At 28, Diana had spent more time in country than most of the officers giving the briefing. She spoke 3 local dialects fluently and had cultivated relationships with village elders across the region. Her reports were thorough, her analysis precise, and her recommendations consistently accurate. Yet somehow her voice never seemed to carry the same weight as the others in the room. Major Thompson stood at the front of the room, his pointer tracing a path across the digital map projected on the wall. "Intelligence suggests the valley is clear for civilian evacuation," he announced, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never walked those particular hills. "Satellite imagery shows no hostile movement in the past 72 hours. Diana's pen paused above her notepad. She had submitted a report just yesterday, warning of unusual activity in the eastern approaches. Small groups of fighters had been spotted moving through the high passes, avoiding the main roads. The timing suggested coordination, preparation for something larger. But her report had been filed under low priority and marked for further assessment. She raised her hand slightly, then lowered it. Around her, the other analysts nodded along with Thompson's assessment. Lieutenant Morrison, fresh from stateside with a degree in international relations and 6 weeks of field experience, leaned forward eagerly. "The thermal imaging confirms it, sir. Nothing larger than livestock in the entire sector." Diana bit back her response. Thermal imaging was useless in these mountains during the heat of the day. The rocks absorbed and reflected heat signatures, creating false readings that could hide an entire platoon. She had learned this the hard way during her first deployment, when she had trusted the technology over her instincts. The mistake had nearly cost 3 soldiers their lives. Sergeant Walsh, seated 2 chairs to her left, caught her eye and raised an eyebrow. He was one of the few who had been in country as long as she had, and he knew the value of her local knowledge. But Walsh was infantry, not intelligence, and his opinion carried about as much weight as hers in these briefings. "Ma'am," Walsh said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear, "you've got that look again." Diana glanced at him, then back at her notepad. She had filled 3 pages with details about the civilian population in the target villages. Families with small children, elderly who couldn't travel far, a medical clinic that served the entire valley. The evacuation plan called for a single convoy through the main road, but that road was visible from every ridgeline for miles. If she was right about the enemy movement, if they were planning something, the convoy would be walking into a trap. Thompson continued his briefing, outlining the extraction timeline. Transport arrives at 0800 hours. We'll have the civilians loaded and moving by 0900. The route is straightforward main road to the highway, then north to the secure zone. Total travel time, 90 minutes. Deanna's fingers tightened around her pen. 90 minutes of exposure on an open road, with nowhere to take cover and no alternate routes if things went wrong. She had recommended a different approach in her. Report smaller groups, multiple routes, overland through the difficult terrain where vehicles couldn't follow. It would take longer, but it would be safer. Questions? Thompson asked, his tone suggesting he didn't really want any. This time, Deanna didn't hesitate. She raised her hand fully, waiting for acknowledgement. Thompson's eyes found hers with the resigned expression of someone who knew what was coming. Yes, Crawford? Sir, I've been tracking movement patterns in the eastern approaches. There's been unusual activity over the past week. Small groups moving at night, avoiding the main routes. I believe we should consider Crawford. Thompson interrupted, his voice carrying a warning. We've been through this. Your concerns have been noted and evaluated. The current assessment stands. A ripple of uncomfortable silence passed through the room. Deanna felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her, some sympathetic, others annoyed. She had been through this before, many times. Her reports were always noted and evaluated, but rarely acted upon. She was the analyst who saw threats where others saw clear skies, who complicated simple plans with unnecessary precautions. Sir, with respect, she pressed on, the thermal imaging won't show you what I saw yesterday. There are cooking fires in the high passes, positions that haven't been used in months. The local population has been moving their livestock to different grazing areas. These are signs of Crawford. Thompson's voice was sharp now, cutting through the room like a blade. Your tendency to see conspiracies where none exist is noted. But we work with verified intelligence here, not gut feelings. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Deanna felt her face flush, but she kept her expression neutral. Around her, the other analyst studiously avoided eye contact. She had been branded, officially and publicly, as the one who cried wolf. But she wasn't done. Sir, I have photographic evidence of the camps, grid coordinates. I can show you. That's enough. Thompson's voice was final. Your objections are noted. The plan stands as brief. Deanna closed her notepad slowly, her hands steady despite the anger building in her chest. She had spent 18 months building credibility, learning the terrain, and understanding the enemy. But 18 months of being right didn't matter if the 19th time she was wrong. And she had been wrong before once, 6 months ago, when she had flagged a potential ambush site that turned out to be empty. It had cost the unit 6 hours of extra travel time and a missed opportunity to intercept a supply convoy. One mistake. One false alarm. And now every subsequent warning was viewed through that lens. As the briefing broke up, Diana remained in her seat, watching the other analysts file out. Some chatted excitedly about the mission, others complained about the heat. None of them mentioned her outburst, but she could feel their judgment in the careful way they avoided her gaze. Walsh lingered as the room emptied. You know, he said quietly, I've been out there with you. I've seen what you see. For what it's worth, I think you're right about this one. Deanna nodded her thanks, but it wasn't worth much. Walsh's opinion wouldn't change the mission parameters or add additional security to the convoy. It wouldn't save lives if she was right and they were wrong. They think I'm paranoid, she said, more to herself than to Walsh. Maybe, he replied. But paranoid people tend to live longer out here. After he left, Diana sat alone in the briefing room, staring at the digital map still glowing on the wall. The valley looked peaceful from this angle, just a collection of small villages connected by a single road. But she knew better. She knew about the cave systems in the eastern hills, about the weapons caches hidden in the abandoned buildings, about the network of informants who could relay convoy movements faster than any radio. She opened her notepad again and began writing. Not an official report this time, but a personal record. If things went wrong tomorrow, if the convoy was attacked, if civilians died, she wanted there to be a record of what she had seen, what she had tried to warn them about. The guard rotation changed outside her window. New faces, same weapons, same confident expressions. They trusted the intelligence briefing, trusted the satellite imagery, trusted the officers who had never walked the ground they were supposed to protect. They didn't know about the cooking fires in the high passes or the way the local children had stopped playing in the streets near the valley entrance. Diana finished writing and closed the notebook. Tomorrow she will be proven right or wrong. But tonight, she would prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. She had learned, over 18 months of being dismissed and ignored, that sometimes the best you could do was be ready for the moment when being right mattered more than being popular. The desert night was falling outside, bringing with it the kind of quiet that made every sound seem amplified. Somewhere in the darkness, she knew, small groups of fighters were moving through the high passes, avoiding the thermal cameras and satellite coverage, preparing for something that wouldn't show up on any official intelligence assessment. She gathered her materials and headed for the door. There was work to do, preparation to make, and only a few hours until dawn. In the morning, 53 civilians would board trucks and begin a journey that would either vindicate her concerns or confirm her reputation as the analyst who saw threats everywhere. Either way, she would be ready. Dawn came with the mechanical precision of military routine. At 0530 hours, generators hummed to life across forward operating base meridian. Diesel engines coughed and settled into their steady rumble. Coffee percolated in the mess tent while radio operators ran through their morning communications checks, voices crackling across multiple frequencies as they confirmed contact with units scattered across the region. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Diana Crawford had been awake for 2 hours already. She stood at the eastern perimeter fence, binoculars pressed to her eyes, scanning the ridgelines that caught the first pale light of sunrise. The air was still cool, carrying the sharp scent of sage and the underlying dust that never quite settled in this part of the world. In the distance, the mountains rose like broken teeth against the sky, their shadows dark and unforgiving. Through her binoculars, she could see the village of Kalur nestled in the valley below. Smoke rose from a few cooking fires, thin gray columns. That dissipated quickly in the morning breeze. But something was wrong with the pattern. Yesterday, there had been 23 cooking fires visible from this vantage point. Today, she counted only 8. She lowered the binoculars and made a note in her field book. Reduced civilian activity could mean many things: people sleeping late, conserving fuel, or preparing for travel. But combined with everything else she had observed, it suggested something more troubling. People were leaving, quietly and without announcement, the way they did when they expected trouble. "Still playing fortune teller, Crawford?" The voice belonged to Lieutenant Morrison, who had approached with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been wrong about anything important. His uniform was crisp despite the early hour, his boots polished to a mirror shine that would last exactly 5 minutes in the field. He carried a tablet computer loaded with the latest intelligence updates, satellite feeds, and digital mapping software. "Just checking the morning patterns," Diana replied without turning around. She didn't need to see his face to know the expression, the slightly condescending smile that suggested he was humoring a child's fascination with toy soldiers. Patterns, Morrison repeated, as if tasting the word. You know, we have actual intelligence assets for that now. Drones, satellites, signals intercept. Real data, not... He gestured vaguely at her binoculars and notepad. Whatever this is. Deanna finally turned to face him. Morrison was 3 years younger than her, with the kind of confidence that came from graduating at the top of his class and never having that confidence tested by reality. His deployment to FOB Meridian was his first overseas assignment, and he approached it with the enthusiasm of someone solving an academic exercise. "How many cooking fires do you see in Collar Village?" she asked, offering him the binoculars. Morrison accepted them with a slight frown, as if this were some kind of test he wasn't sure he wanted to take. He raised them to his eyes and scanned the valley for a long moment. "I see ... smoke, some buildings. It looks normal to me." "Count the fires." "Crawford, I don't really have time for 8, Deanna said. "Yesterday there were 23, the day before 22. For the past 6 months, the average has been between 20 and 25 every morning." Morrison lowered the binoculars and looked at her with the expression of someone who had just realized they were dealing with a person who counted individual trees instead of seeing the forest. "You've been counting cooking fires for 6 months?" "I've been tracking civilian population patterns, yes. Cooking fires, livestock movement, market activity, school attendance. When those patterns change suddenly, it usually means something." "Or," Morrison said, handing back the binoculars, "it means people overslept, or ran out of firewood, or decided to eat a cold breakfast. You're reading tea leaves, Crawford." Before Deanna could respond, her radio crackled to life. "All stations. All stations, this is Meridian Control. Execute Operation Safeguard. I say again, execute Operation Safeguard. Convoy departure in T-3 hours." The evacuation had begun. Morrison straightened at the radio call, his casual demeanor shifting into something more focused. "Well, that's our cue. Time to get these people to safety." He started walking back toward the command center, then paused. "You know, Crawford, you might want to work on being a team player. All this lone wolf intelligence gathering isn't doing your career any favors." Deanna watched him go, then turned back to the valley. In the growing light, she could see the first convoy trucks moving down the access road toward Collar Village. 3 vehicles, armored and bristling with communications equipment, carrying the soldiers who would coordinate the evacuation, moved with the steady confidence of a well-planned operation, following the route that had been mapped and approved and deemed safe by people who had never set foot in that particular valley. She raised her radio to her lips and switched to the convoy frequency. "Meridian Control, this is Crawford. Requesting permission to accompany the advance team." The response came back immediately, and it wasn't from Control. It was Major Thompson's voice, sharp with irritation. "Crawford, your position is here at base. You're not part of the field team for this operation." "Sir, I have extensive local knowledge that could be valuable, Crawford." The warning in Thompson's voice was unmistakable. "You've made your concerns known multiple times. Your role in this operation is to monitor from here and provide analytical support as needed. Is that understood?" Deanna felt something cold settle in her stomach. They were cutting her out entirely, relegating her to a desk job while the operation she had tried to warn them about unfolded in the field. "Understood, sir." She clipped the radio back to her belt and stared down at the convoy. Vehicles, now small specks moving along the valley road. In 3 hours, those trucks would be loaded with civilians' families, children, elderly people who trusted their government to keep them safe. And she would be sitting in the intelligence tent, watching it happen on a screen. The morning routine continued around her. Soldiers moved with purpose between buildings, carrying gear and checking equipment. The mess tent served breakfast to crews preparing for various missions. Normal sounds, normal activities, The kind of organized efficiency that made you believe everything was under control. But Deanna couldn't shake the feeling that they were all performing a carefully choreographed dance on the edge of a cliff. She made her way to the intelligence center, a prefabricated building filled with computers, radios, and wall-mounted displays showing feeds from various surveillance sources. The duty officer, Staff Sergeant Lopez, looked up as she entered. "Morning, Crawford. Ready for the big day?" "As ready as I can be from here," Deanna replied, settling into her workstation. She pulled up the satellite feeds showing the convoy route, cross-referencing them with the topographical maps she had studied so many times. She could draw them from memory. The screen showed the road winding through the valley like a pale scar across the landscape. On either side, the hills rose steeply, covered with scrub brush and scattered rocks that could hide a dozen different threats. The official assessment marked the route as low risk, but Deanna knew that assessment was based on outdated intelligence and wishful thinking. "Hey Lopez," she said, not taking her eyes off the screen. "Pull up the overnight signals and intercept reports." Lopez typed at his keyboard, frowning at the results. "That's weird. We're showing minimal chatter, almost like radio silence across the board." Deanna felt that cold feeling in her stomach intensify. Radio silence wasn't normal for this region. The various factions and tribal groups maintained constant communication networks, coordinating everything from trade routes to family visits. When the radios went quiet, it usually meant someone had issued orders to maintain operational security. "What about the drone feeds?" "Clean," Lopez reported. "No movement larger than individual civilians. A few vehicles on the main roads, but nothing unusual." Deanna switched to the live feed from the convoy. She could see the lead vehicles approaching the village outskirts, where clusters of civilians waited with their belongings. Children clung to their parents' hands, while elderly villagers sat on bundles of possessions they couldn't bear to leave behind. The image was peaceful, almost pastoral, but peaceful images could be deceiving. She opened a new window and began cross-referencing the current intelligence with historical pattern analysis. Over the past 18 months, she had documented dozens of small indicators that preceded major attacks. Changes in civilian behavior, shifts in communications patterns, unusual movement in the high country. Individually, each indicator was meaningless. Together, they painted a picture that made her hands shake slightly as she typed. The radio crackled with updates from the field team. "Meridian Control, this is Ground Team Alpha, arriving at the primary collection point. The civilian population appears calm and cooperative. Beginning loading procedures." Major Thompson's voice responded with satisfaction. "Copy, Ground Team Alpha. Proceed according to the timeline." Diana pulled up the timeline on her screen. Loading would take 30 minutes. The convoy would depart at 0900 hours sharp, following the main road north through the mountain pass. By 10:30, they would be in the safe zone. Mission accomplished, unless she was right about what was waiting in those hills. She opened her personal notes and began typing a detailed log of everything she was observing. If the worst happened, if the convoy was attacked, she wanted there to be a record of the warnings that had been ignored. Not for vindication, she took no pleasure in being right about disasters, but for the families who deserved to know that someone had tried to prevent what was coming. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the cool air and beginning its daily transformation of the desert into a furnace. On her screen, she watched the first civilians being helped into the convoy trucks. A woman lifted her young daughter up to the soldiers who settled the child carefully in the protected interior. An elderly man struggled with a heavy bundle until 2 soldiers assisted him. Normal people, living normal lives, trusting their government to keep them safe. Diana's radio buzzed with an incoming call on her personal frequency. It was Sergeant Walsh, broadcasting from the convoy's security perimeter. "Crawford, you there? She keyed her mic. "Here, Walsh. I'm looking at those eastern approaches you mentioned. Can't see anything specific, but something feels off." The locals seemed nervous, more than you'd expect for a routine evacuation. Deanna felt a flicker of validation, followed immediately by dread. Walsh had good instincts, and if he was picking up on the same subtle signs she had noticed, it meant the threat was real and growing. Any unusual activity? Hard to say, it's more what's not here. Usually, kids would be running around during something like this, making noise, treating it like an adventure. But they're all staying close to their parents, real quiet. And I haven't seen any of the local men who usually hang around to watch our operations. The missing men. Diana hadn't even thought about that indicator, but Walsh was right. During previous operations, local men often gathered to observe, curious about American military procedures. Their absence could mean they had been warned, away, or recruited, or simply decided that today was not a safe day to be visible. "Walsh, I need you to do something for me. Check the high ground to your east, about 2 clicks up the valley. Look for anything that doesn't belong. New paths. Disturbed ground, anything. Already ahead of you. I borrowed some binoculars from the squad leader. Give me a second." Deanna waited, watching the loading operation continue on her screen. More families were climbing into the trucks, settling in for what they hoped would be a routine journey to safety. The soldiers moved efficiently, professionally, following protocols that had been tested and refined through countless similar operations. Walsh's voice came back, tense with concern. "Crawford, I'm seeing what looks like fresh earth about halfway. Up the eastern slope. Could be recent digging. And there are some kind of reflections up there, like metal or glass catching the light." Deanna's hands flew across her keyboard, pulling up detailed topographical data for the coordinates Walsh was describing. The slope he was looking at had perfect sight lines down to the road, with multiple escape routes through the back country. If someone wanted to set up an ambush, they couldn't ask for a better position. She grabbed her radio and switched to the command frequency. "Meridian Control, this is Crawford. I'm receiving reports of possible hostile activity on the eastern approaches to the convoy route." The response was immediate and irritating. "Crawford, we've been through this. Stand down." "Sir, I have a ground observer reporting fresh digging and possible equipment positions on the hillside. Request permission to investigate or delay the convoy until Crawford." Thompson's voice was sharp enough to cut through steel. "You are ordered to cease this line of inquiry immediately. The operation will proceed as planned." The command channel went silent. Around the intelligence center, other analysts glanced in her direction with expressions ranging from sympathy to annoyance. She had crossed the line from persistent to insubordinate, and everyone knew it. But on her screen, she could see the convoy trucks fully loaded now, engines running, ready to depart. 53 civilians, including 12 children under the age of 10, settling in for what they trusted would be a safe journey home. Diana stared at the screen and made a decision. That would define the rest of her life. She opened a new communication channel, one that bypassed the official command structure, and began typing a message that would brand her as something far worse than an alarmist. She was about to become a traitor. The message, Deanna Crawford typed, would later be dissected by military investigators, analyzed by intelligence committees, and cited in court proceedings that would posthumously strip her of rank and benefits. But at that moment, sitting in the intelligence center with her fingers hovering over the keyboard, she wasn't thinking about the consequences. She was thinking about 12 children under the age of 10 settling into convoy trucks that were about to drive into what she believed was a carefully prepared killing zone. She opened a secure communication channel that connected directly to the regional command center, bypassing the local chain of command entirely. The message was simple, direct, and would be interpreted as the action of someone who had lost faith in her immediate superiors. Urgent. Intelligence indicates imminent threat to Operation Safeguard convoy route. Recommend immediate halt and reassessment. Fresh enemy positions observed eastern approaches. Current assessment appears compromised. Request immediate intervention. Crawford, D-Intelligence Analyst, FOB Meridian. She hit send before she could reconsider. The response came back within 4 minutes, and it wasn't from Regional Command. It was from Major Thompson, and his voice over the radio carried the kind of cold fury that ended careers. Crawford, report. To my office immediately. Every head in the intelligence center turned toward her. Staff Sergeant Lopez stared at his screen with the expression of someone who had just watched a colleague commit professional suicide. The duty communications operator, Private Chun, pretended to be fascinated by his equipment calibration. The silence stretched until the air conditioning unit cycling on sounded like thunder. Deanna saved her work, locked her terminal, and stood. Her legs felt steady, which surprised her. She had expected the physical symptoms of fear-shaking hands, racing heart, the metallic taste that came with adrenaline. Instead, she felt strangely calm, as if she had finally stopped fighting against a current that had been pulling her in this direction for months. The walk to Thompson's office took her across the central compound, past soldiers preparing for various missions, past the motor pool where mechanics worked on vehicles, past the mess tent where the morning shift was cleaning up after breakfast. Normal military life, proceeding with the confidence that came from institutional structure and clear chains of command. She was about to become the person who had stepped outside that structure, and everyone would know it within the hour. Thompson's office was in the administrative building, a prefabricated structure that tried to project authority through carefully arranged furniture and military regulations posted on every wall. His aide, Corporal Martinez, looked up as Diana approached, his expression carefully neutral in the way that suggested he already knew why she was there. "He's waiting for you," Martinez said, gesturing toward the inner office door. Thompson sat behind his desk, his hands folded, his expression controlled in the way that senior officers learned when they needed to deliver career-ending news. He didn't invite her to sit. Behind him, a large-scale map of the region covered most of the wall, marked with pins and colored strings that represented various ongoing operations. Operation Safeguard was marked with a green line that looked clean and simple from this distance. "Crawford," Thompson began, his voice level and professional. "In 22 years of military service, I have never had a subordinate go outside the chain of command to contradict orders I had personally given." Deanna remained at attention, staring at a point just above Thompson's head. The window behind him showed the convoy staging area, where the last trucks were pulling into formation. From this angle, the operation looked efficient, organized, and successful. "You sent an unauthorized message to Regional Command," Thompson continued, "suggesting that I am either incompetent or deliberately ignoring valid intelligence threats. You have undermined the authority of this command and called into question the safety of an operation that has been planned and approved at multiple levels." He stood and walked around the desk, stopping close enough that Diana could smell his aftershave and see the slight redness around his eyes that suggested he had been up most of the night reviewing the operation details. "I want you to understand something, Crawford. Your message has been forwarded to the investigation division. By dinner tonight, there will be a formal inquiry into your fitness for duty. By tomorrow morning, you will likely be on a transport plane back to the States, where you will face charges of insubordination, undermining military operations, and possibly sedition." Diana absorbed this information without reaction. She had expected it, hoped it wouldn't come to this, but expected it nonetheless. What surprised her was that Thompson seemed genuinely angry, not just professionally offended. There was something personal in his tone, as if her actions had wounded him beyond their impact on his command authority. "Sir," she said, "I respectfully request permission to explain my assessment." "Your assessment?" Thompson's voice rose slightly. Crawford, your assessment has been noted, reviewed, and found to be unsupported by credible intelligence. You have repeatedly raised alarms based on speculation and pattern recognition that border on paranoia. And now, when those alarms have been properly evaluated and dismissed, you've chosen to go over my head to suggest that this entire command structure is incompetent. He returned to his desk and picked up a folder that Deanna recognized as her personnel file. Do you know what this says about you, Crawford? It says you're an analyst with exceptional attention to detail and a tendency toward worst-case scenario thinking. It says you've submitted 47 separate threat assessments in the past 18 months, of which 46 proved to be false alarms or gross overestimations of risk. And the 47th? Thompson's expression hardened. The 47th identified a supply convoy ambush that resulted in the capture of valuable intelligence about enemy supply routes. Yes, Crawford, you were right once. Congratulations. The words hit her like physical blows. She had been keeping her own count, her own assessment of her accuracy rate, but hearing it laid out so starkly made her question everything she thought. She knew about her own judgment. 46 false alarms. 46 times she had seen threats that weren't there, raised concerns that proved unfounded, caused delays and complications for operations that proceeded safely without her recommended precautions. Maybe she was paranoid. Maybe the cooking fires and radio silence and nervous civilians were just the random fluctuations of normal life, not the careful orchestration of a planned attack. Maybe Morrison was right about tea leaves and fortune-telling. But then she thought about Walsh's voice over the radio, describing fresh digging and reflections that could be weapon optics. She thought about the systematic way the local men had disappeared from the village. She thought about the pattern of small indicators that, in her experience, preceded every major attack she had witnessed or studied. "Sir," she said, "I believe the convoy is in immediate danger." Thompson closed the file and set it aside. When he looked at her again, his expression was almost pitiful. "Crawford, I'm going to give you one chance to salvage what's left of your career. You're going to write a formal retraction of your message to Regional Command. You're going to acknowledge that your assessment was based on incomplete information and personal speculation. And you're going to request a transfer to a position more suited to your analytical style." Through the window, Deanna could see the convoy beginning to move. 3 trucks loaded with civilians, surrounded by military escort vehicles, rolled toward the valley road at exactly the pace and timing that had been briefed that morning. Professional, efficient, according to plan. And if I refuse? Then, in addition to the insubordination charges, I'll recommend you for psychological evaluation. Because frankly, Crawford, this level of persistent alarm over threats that don't exist suggests problems that go beyond professional disagreement. The convoy disappeared behind the administrative building, heading for the access road that would take them down into the valley. 53 people, including 12 children, trusting that the American military would deliver them safely to the secure zone. Trusting that the intelligence assessment was accurate, that the route was clear, that the threats had been properly evaluated. Diana made a choice that would define everything that followed. "I refuse, sir." Thompson studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she was brave or simply broken. "Very well. You're confined to quarters pending the arrival of the investigation team. You're stripped of access to all intelligence systems and communication equipment. Corporal Martinez will escort you to your quarters and post a guard." He reached for his phone, then paused. "Crawford, I want you to understand something. This isn't personal. You're a good analyst when you stick to facts instead of chasing shadows. But you've become a liability to this command, and I can't allow personal feelings to compromise operational security." "I understand, sir." But as Martinez stepped forward to escort her out, Deanna's radio crackled with a transmission from the convoy. It was Walsh's voice, tight with tension. "Meridian Control. This is ground team security. We have movement on the eastern ridge. Multiple contacts, approximately 2 clicks from the convoy route. Thompson grabbed his own radio. Ground team security. Specify movement type and threat assessment. Sir, it appears to be coordinated positioning. I count at least 12 individuals with what look like heavy weapons. They're moving into overwatch positions above the road. The office fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of helicopter rotors. Through the window, Diana could see activity increasing around the command center as duty officers responded to the transmission. Thompson's face had gone pale. He keyed his radio again. Ground team security, are you certain of your assessment? Sir, I'm looking at them through binoculars. They're setting up what looks like a coordinated ambush position. Recommend immediate halt of convoy movement. Copy, ground team security. Convoy halt, convoy halt. All vehicles stop movement immediately. Thompson set down his radio and looked at Deanna with an expression she couldn't quite read. Anger was still there, but it was mixed with something else, uncertainty, perhaps, or the beginning of doubt. Crawford, he said slowly, if you're right about this ... Sir, I recommend immediate extraction of the convoy via an alternate route. The high country path I marked in my report yesterday, it's longer, but it avoids the kill zone entirely. Thompson's jaw worked silently for a moment. Then he picked up his radio again. All stations, this is Meridian Control. Implement contingency. Plan Charlie. I repeat, implement contingency plan Charlie. Contingency plan Charlie was the extraction route Diana had recommended in her dismissed report. The path through the high country that would take twice as long but keep the convoy off the main road entirely. But even as Thompson gave the order, more radio traffic was coming in. The eastern ridge wasn't the only problem. Meridian Control, this is Overwatch 2. I have movement on the western approaches as well. Looks like a coordinated pincer movement designed to trap the convoy in the valley. Meridian Control, this is Ground Team Alpha. Civilians are asking about the delay. Some are getting nervous. How long do we hold the position? Meridian Control, this is air support. We're seeing heat signatures throughout the high country. This looks bigger than a simple ambush. Recommend immediate close air support. Thompson's orderly world of clear intelligence assessments and approved operational plans was collapsing around him. The convoy was stopped in an exposed position, surrounded by threats that weren't supposed to exist, facing a coordinated attack that his intelligence had failed to predict. He looked at Deanna again, and this time she could read his expression clearly. It was the look of a commander who had just realized that his career-defining operation was about to become a disaster, and that the person he had just branded as a paranoid troublemaker might be the only one who had seen it coming. Crawford, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, what do you recommend? But before she could answer, the radio exploded with urgent transmissions. The convoy was under fire. The first shots came from the eastern ridge at 0947 hours, 3. Sharp cracks that echoed off the valley walls, like the sound of the world breaking apart. In Major Thompson's office, the radio exploded with overlapping voices, convoy drivers reporting contact, security teams calling for support, civilians screaming in the background of transmissions that cut in and out as vehicles took evasive action. Meridian Control were taking fire from multiple positions. RPG, impact on lead vehicle, vehicle disabled. Civilians are trapped in the kill zone. We need immediate extraction. Thompson grabbed his radio with one hand and reached for his phone. With the other, trying to coordinate a response to a situation that was spiraling beyond anyone's control. Through his office window, Deanna could see soldiers running toward the motor pool, medics preparing emergency equipment, and officers shouting orders that couldn't be heard over the growing chaos. Get me close air support, Thompson barked into his phone. How long until we have eyes on target? The answer came back crackling with static. Sir, closest air assets are 40 minutes out. Medevac is grounded due to mechanical issues. Ground support is staging but won't reach the convoy for at least 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Diana did the math automatically. In 20 minutes, a coordinated ambush could kill every person in those convoy trucks. She had studied enough after-action reports to know how these things developed. The attackers had chosen their position carefully, with overlapping fields of fire and predetermined escape routes. They wouldn't waste time with prolonged engagement when they could achieve maximum casualties quickly and withdraw before reinforcements arrived. Sir, she said, her voice cutting through Thompson's rapid-fire communications. I know another way. Thompson looked at her with the wild eyes of a man watching his career and his people die simultaneously. What way? The service road behind the old quarry. It connects to the valley floor through a series of switchbacks that aren't visible from the main ridge lines. A small team could reach the convoy location in 15 minutes. Crawford, you're confined to quarters. You don't. Another burst of radio traffic interrupted him. Meridian Control, second vehicle is hit. We have civilian casualties. Request immediate medical evacuation. The words hung in the air like smoke. Civilian casualties. The thing every military commander feared most. The outcome that would haunt Thompson for the rest of his life, regardless of what happened next. Diana could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, weighing regulations against results. Protocol against lives, the service road, he said. How do you know about it? I've walked every trail in this valley. The road was built during the Soviet occupation for moving equipment to the mining operation. It's too narrow for convoy vehicles, but it could handle a rescue team with light vehicles. Thompson stared at her for a moment that stretched like hours. Around them, the base was mobilizing for a crisis response that would arrive too late to matter. Radio chatter filled the air with reports of mounting casualties and deteriorating conditions. Somewhere in that valley, 53 civilians were learning what it felt like to be trapped in a war zone. Martinez, Thompson called to his aide. Get me Lieutenant Peterson and a volunteer rescue team. Light vehicles, medical supplies, whatever they can carry. Sir, Martinez replied. Lieutenant Peterson is leading the main response team. He won't be available for another operation. Then get me Morrison. He wanted field experience. Deanna felt something cold settle in her stomach. Morrison was enthusiastic but inexperienced, the kind of officer who knew tactics from textbooks, but had never navigated hostile terrain under fire. Sending him on a rescue mission through unmarked mountain trails would be like sending a navigation student to land a fighter jet in a thunderstorm. Sir, she said quietly, Morrison doesn't know the terrain. Then he'll have to learn fast. Thompson's voice carried the brittle edge of a man making decisions under pressure he had never experienced before. You're confined to quarters, Crawford. This conversation is over. But even as he said it, more radio traffic was coming in. The situation was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated. Meridian Control, lead vehicle is completely disabled. We're extracting civilians on foot, but taking heavy fire. We can't hold this position much longer. Control, this is air reconnaissance. I count at least 30 enemy fighters in coordinated positions. This isn't a random attack, this is a planned operation. 30 fighters. Diana felt her tactical assessment crystallizing into horrible clarity. This wasn't just an ambush, it was a coordinated assault designed to inflict maximum casualties and capture or kill American personnel. The kind of operation that required weeks of planning, detailed intelligence about convoy routes and timing, and coordination between multiple enemy cells. The kind of operation her intelligence reports had been warning about for the past month. Thompson was issuing rapid orders now, trying to coordinate multiple response elements simultaneously. But Diana could hear the strain in his voice. The edge of panic that came when reality exceeded your worst-case planning scenarios. He was a competent officer managing a situation that had moved beyond competence into the realm of desperation. Through the window, she watched Morrison jogging toward the motor pool with a hastily assembled team of soldiers who looked barely old enough to drive, let alone navigate mountain trails under combat conditions. They climbed into lightweight vehicles that would be fast but offered no protection against the kind of heavy weapons the enemy was reportedly using. Morrison's team would be brave. She knew they would follow orders and do their best to reach the trapped convoy. But they would be operating without detailed knowledge of the terrain, without understanding of the local tactical environment, and without the kind of route-specific intelligence that could mean the difference between rescue and creating more casualties. Deanna watched them drive away and made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She walked calmly to Thompson's desk and picked up a set of vehicle keys that were sitting beside his computer. The keys belonged to his personal utility vehicle, a lightweight all-terrain transport that he used for inspection tours around the base. "Crawford, what are you doing?" "What I should have done hours ago," she replied. Pocketing the keys, Thompson started to stand, but another radio transmission froze him in place. "Meridian Control, we have children separated from the main group. Repeat, we have children in the open, taking fire. We need immediate support. Children in the open." The words hit Thompson like physical blows, and Deanna saw something change in his expression. The rigid adherence to protocol, the concern about chain of command and proper procedures, all of it crumbled in the face of that simple, devastating image. "Sir," Deanna said, "I can reach them." Thompson looked at her with the expression of a drowning man being offered a rope he wasn't sure he could trust. "Crawford, if you leave this base without authorization, you'll be court-martialed for desertion under fire." "Yes, sir." "If you take military equipment without permission, you'll be charged with theft of government property during a combat operation." "Yes, sir." "If you interfere with an ongoing military operation, you'll be charged with obstruction and possibly treason." "I understand, sir." Thompson stared at her for a long moment, weighing something she couldn't quite read. Then he turned back to his radio, his voice carefully neutral. "I'll be in communications with the response teams. I won't be monitoring vehicle movements around the base for the next 30 minutes. It wasn't permission. It wasn't authorized. It was simply a commander choosing not to see something that needed to happen. Deanna nodded and walked toward the door. As she reached for the handle, Thompson's voice stopped her. "Crawford," she turned back, "bring them home." The motor pool was chaotic. Mechanics worked frantically to prepare additional vehicles while soldiers, LOADED equipment, and supplies for various response missions. In the confusion of urgent activity, one more person moving with purpose through the organized disorder barely registered. Deanna found Thompson's vehicle parked behind the maintenance building, a small all-terrain utility truck designed for command inspection tours rather than combat operations. It had no armor, no weapons mounting, no communications equipment beyond a basic radio. But it was fast, maneuverable, and could handle terrain that would stop larger vehicles. She performed a quick inspection: fuel, oil, tire pressure, emergency supplies. In the back, she found a basic medical kit, emergency water, and a toolkit that included bolt cutters. She added her own gear, her detailed topographical maps, her field notebook with coordinates for every significant landmark in the valley, and her personal weapon. The engine turned over smoothly. She adjusted the seat and mirrors, tested the radio, and reviewed her mental map of the route she would take. The service road behind the quarry was unmarked on official maps, but she had walked it during her off-duty explorations of the region. It was dangerous, narrow, winding, with sections that would be impassable if she encountered enemy forces. But it was also invisible from the main ambush positions, and it would get her to the convoy location faster than any official response could move. as she drove toward the base perimeter. She passed other vehicles heading in different directions. The main response team taking the long route through secure territory, supply trucks moving toward staging areas, medical personnel preparing for casualties that were already mounting, normal responses to an abnormal situation, professional soldiers doing their jobs according to training and doctrine that assumed certain things about intelligence accuracy, threat assessment, and operational planning. They were brave, competent people following procedures that would have worked perfectly if the situation had been what they thought it was. But the situation was what Deanna had thought it was, not what the official assessment had determined. And that difference meant that by the time the official response reached the convoy, they would be responding to a massacre rather than participating in a rescue dot at the base perimeter. The guard looked at her with mild curiosity. "Ma'am, you're not on the departure roster for today." "Emergency reconnaissance," she replied, showing him the vehicle keys. Major Thompson's orders. It wasn't exactly a lie. Thompson had given her orders to stay confined to quarters. But he had also told her to bring them home, and she chose to interpret that as the order that mattered. The guard waved her through dot as she drove away from forward operating base Meridian. Deanna Crawford felt something she hadn't experienced in months: complete certainty about what she was doing. For the first time since her warnings had started being dismissed, she wasn't second-guessing her assessment or wondering if she was seeing threats that didn't exist. The convoy was under attack. Children were in danger, and she was the only person in position to reach them before it was too late. The service road was worse than she remembered. What had looked like manageable terrain during her walking reconnaissance became a nightmare of switchbacks and loose gravel when approached at the speed necessary to make a difference. The vehicle bounced and slid through turns that dropped away into nothing, with no guardrails and no margin for error, but she knew exactly where she was going and exactly why she was going there. For the first time in months, that was enough. Behind her, radio chatter continued to report deteriorating conditions. Ahead of her, the sound of gunfire grew steadily louder, the sound of automatic weapons. Fire grew clearer as Deanna Crawford navigated the final switchback of the service road. Through gaps in the rocky terrain, she could see smoke rising from the valley floor where the convoy had been stopped. The acrid smell of burning diesel fuel carried on the wind, mixed with the distinctive chemical scent of high explosives, pulled the utility vehicle behind a cluster of boulders and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deceptive. She could hear the distant crack of rifle fire, the heavier thump of rocket-propelled grenades, and underneath it all, the sound that made her hands tighten on her weapon, voices shouting in panic and pain. Deanna opened her topographical map and traced her position with her finger. She was approximately 800 meters from the convoy's last reported location, separated by a rocky slope that would provide concealment but difficult passage. Between her and the trapped vehicles lay terrain that she had studied extensively, but never traversed under combat conditions. She gathered her equipment methodically: medical kit, extra ammunition, bolt cutters, her field notebook with detailed coordinates for every landmark in the valley. Her radio crackled with ongoing reports from the scene. "Meridian Control, we have 15 civilians extracted to cover behind disabled lead vehicles. Still taking heavy fire from multiple directions. We need immediate support. Ground team security. To Control, enemy forces are moving to flank our position. We can't hold much longer." Walsh's voice cut through the chaos, steady despite the circumstances. "Control, this is Walsh. I have eyes on at least 6 children separated from the main group, approximately 200 meters east of the convoy. They're in a depression that's providing temporary cover, but enemy forces are advancing on their position. 6 children." Deanna felt her tactical assessment shift into sharp focus. The main rescue efforts would concentrate on the largest group of civilians where the most people could be saved with available resources. But 6 children in an isolated position would be considered an acceptable loss if it meant saving 47 others. She keyed her radio to Walsh's frequency. "Walsh, this is Crawford. What's your exact position?" The response came back immediately, tight with surprise and relief. "Crawford? Jesus, are you authorized to be out here? What's your position, Walsh?" "I'm with the security perimeter, about 50 meters south of the disabled vehicles." "But Crawford, you can't. The children." "Give me coordinates for the children." A pause filled with the sound of gunfire. Then Walsh's voice, professional despite the chaos around him. "Grid reference 847 to 293. They're in a natural depression behind some fallen rocks. There's a girl, maybe 8 years old, trying to keep the others calm. But enemy forces are moving in from the north, and they'll reach that position in maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Diana studied her map and traced possible approaches to the coordinates Walsh had given her. The most direct route would require crossing open ground that was certainly under enemy observation. The safest route would take 20 minutes she didn't have, but there was a third option, a narrow ravine that ran parallel to the main valley floor, invisible from the ridge positions where the enemy had established their primary firing positions. It would bring her close to the children's location, but it would also put her behind enemy lines with no support and no clear escape route. "Walsh, I'm going after the children." "Crawford, negative. You're not equipped for this. Wait for the main response team." "The main response team is 15 minutes out. Those children don't have 15 minutes." She switched off the radio before Walsh could respond and began moving down the slope. The terrain was even more difficult than she had anticipated. What looked like solid ground from a distance turned out to be loose shale that shifted under every step. She moved carefully, testing each foothold before committing her weight, knowing that a single misstep could send rocks cascading down the slope and reveal her position to enemy forces below that. As she descended, the sounds of combat grew clearer and more distinct. She could hear individual weapons now, the sharp crack of American M4 rifles, the deeper chatter of AK-47s, the whistle of incoming mortar. Between the weapon sounds, she caught fragments of shouted commands in both English and local dialects. The ravine was exactly where her topographical analysis had indicated it would be, a narrow cut in the rocky ground that had been carved by centuries of seasonal flooding. It was deeper than she had expected, providing excellent concealment but making movement slow and treacherous. The bottom was strewn with loose rocks and debris that would make noise if she wasn't careful. She moved through the ravine like water, flowing around obstacles rather than fighting through them. Her training had emphasized speed and stealth in equal measure, but this situation demanded something different: patience, precision, and the kind of tactical thinking that came from understanding terrain as an ally rather than an obstacle. Halfway to her objective, she encountered her first enemy position. 2 fighters had established an overwatch position on the rim of the ravine, their attention focused on the main battle below. They were young, probably local recruits, armed with older generation weapons, but positioned with the kind of tactical sophistication that suggested professional training. One carried a radio and was providing what sounded like target updates. 2 other positions. Diana froze in the shadow of an overhanging rock and assessed her options. She could try to bypass them, but that would require leaving the concealment of the ravine and moving through open ground. She could wait for them to move, but the children didn't have time for patience. Or she could neutralize the threat and continue her approach. The decision was made for her when the radio operator spoke into his handset. "Sector 7. This is Overwatch 2. I have movement near the separated group. Looks like they're trying to reach better cover." The children were trying to move. Without guidance, without understanding of the tactical situation, they were making themselves visible to enemy forces that were already moving to intercept them. Diana drew her sidearm and moved. She climbed the ravine wall with the fluid motion of someone who had spent months learning to read this particular type of terrain. The rock face was steep, but offered enough handholds for a careful ascent. She moved silently, using techniques learned in mountain warfare training that most intelligence analysts never needed. The first fighter never saw her coming. She appeared at the rim of the ravine like a ghost, her weapon already trained on his center mass. The suppressed pistol made almost no sound, just a quiet pop that was lost in the ambient noise of distant gunfire. The second fighter turned at the sound of his partner falling, his own weapon swinging toward the threat. But Diana was already moving, using the momentum of her climb to carry her into a position behind cover. His shots chipped rock inches from her head as she rolled behind the boulder and returned fire. The engagement lasted perhaps 10 seconds. When it was over, both enemy fighters were down, and Diana was moving again, leaving the radio equipment destroyed and the overwatch position neutralized. But her position was compromised now. Other enemy forces would investigate when the overwatch team failed to check in. She had minutes, maybe less, before this area would be swarming with hostile forces. She reached the children's position as the first mortar rounds began falling near the main convoy. The explosions shook the ground and sent debris raining down from the surrounding cliffs. In the natural depression Walsh had described, 6 children huddled together behind fallen rocks, their eyes wide with terror. The oldest was indeed a girl of about 8, just as Walsh had reported. She had positioned herself between the younger children and the direction of the gunfire, her small body trembling, but her voice steady as she whispered reassurances to the others. When she saw Diana approaching, her expression flickered between hope and fear. "American soldier?" she asked in heavily accented English. "Yes," Diana replied, dropping into the depression beside them. "I'm here to get you to safety." She performed a rapid assessment of the children. 2 boys who looked like brothers, perhaps 5 and 7 years old. Twin girls who couldn't be more than 4, clinging to each other with the desperate intensity of shared terror. A baby, maybe 18 months old, in the arms of another girl who was probably his sister. 6 children, the youngest barely old enough to walk, trapped in a combat zone with enemy forces closing in and no clear path to safety. Diana opened her field notebook and sketched a quick route map. The return path couldn't follow the same route she had used to reach them. That area would be compromised by now. But there was another option, a more difficult path that would take them through rocky terrain that vehicles couldn't navigate. "Listen to me," she said to the 8-year-old girl, speaking slowly and clearly. "We're going to play a game. We're going to pretend we're mountain goats, moving very quietly through the rocks. Can you help me make sure everyone stays quiet?" The girl nodded solemnly, understanding that this was not really a game, but accepting the framework that would help the younger children cope with what was coming. Diana distributed her emergency water among the children and used her medical kit to treat minor cuts and scrapes that several of them had sustained. As she worked, she monitored her radio for updates on the overall tactical situation. The news was not encouraging. The main convoy was still pinned down, taking casualties from multiple directions. Morrison's rescue team had encountered heavy resistance and been forced to withdraw. Air support was still 20 minutes out, and ground reinforcements were bogged down by terrain difficulties and enemy countermeasures. But there was one piece of information that gave her hope. Walsh had managed to coordinate the extraction of most of the adult civilians to a more defensible position. If she could get the children to that location, they would be under the protection of the main security perimeter. The problem was that the defensible position was nearly a kilometer away, across terrain that was now crawling with enemy forces actively hunting for targets. She gathered the children around her and explained the plan in terms they could understand. They would move together, staying low and quiet, following paths that would keep them hidden from the people who were making the loud noises. The older children would help the younger ones, and everyone would do exactly what she told them to do. What she didn't tell them was that the route she had chosen would take them through some of the most dangerous terrain in the valley, past enemy positions that could kill them all if they made a single mistake. As they prepared to move, the 8-year-old girl tugged on Deanna's sleeve. "American soldier," she whispered. "Are you scared?" Diana looked into the child's eyes and saw intelligence, courage, and a trust that she had done nothing to earn but everything to honor. "Yes," she said quietly, "but I'm more brave than I am scared, and so are you." The girl smiled for the first time since Diana had found her. "I will be brave like you." They began moving as the sun reached its zenith, turning the valley into a furnace and the rocks around them into surfaces too. Hot to touch. Diana led them through a maze of boulders and narrow passages, following routes that existed only in her memory and on hand-drawn maps that no official survey had ever recorded. Behind them, the battle for the convoy continued to rage. Ahead of them lay nearly a kilometer of the most dangerous ground any of them had ever crossed, but they were moving together. 7 people who had found each other in the worst possible circumstances, united by nothing more than the conviction that children deserved to go home safe. The first 500 meters took 43 minutes. Diana Crawford moved through the rocky terrain with 6 children following in single file, each step calculated to avoid loose stones that might cascade down the slope and reveal their position. The 8-year-old girl, who had told Diana her name was Amira, proved to be remarkably capable of keeping the younger children calm and focused. She translated Diana's whispered instructions into their local dialect and used a combination of gentle encouragement and stern older sister authority to maintain discipline among the group. The baby, carried by his 10-year-old sister Nadia, had mercifully fallen asleep despite the distant sound of gunfire. The twin 4-year-olds held hands and followed Amira with the kind of absolute trust that children reserve for those who project confidence in terrifying situations. The 2 boys, brothers named Hassan and Omar, brought up the rear with expressions of fierce concentration that suggested they understood exactly how serious their situation was. Diana paused at a junction between 2 possible routes and consulted her mental map of the terrain. To the left, a narrow path wound between tall rocks that would provide excellent concealment, but would take them dangerously close to enemy positions she had identified during her approach. To the right, a more open route offered faster movement, but would expose them to observation from multiple directions. She chose neither. Instead, she led the children up a steep slope that didn't appear on any map, following game trails and natural ledges that she had discovered during her solitary explorations of the valley. It was the most difficult route possible, requiring the children to climb over obstacles that were nearly as tall as they were, but it would keep them completely invisible from the established enemy positions. "American soldier," Amira whispered. As they paused to rest behind a cluster of boulders, "The little ones are getting tired." Diana looked back at the group and saw the exhaustion beginning to show in their faces. The twins were breathing heavily, their small hands scraped from climbing over rough rocks. Hassan, the younger brother, was trying not to cry from what looked like a twisted ankle. They had covered less than half the distance to safety, and the most dangerous part of the journey still lay ahead. She distributed more water and used her medical kit to treat Hassan's ankle, wrapping it with elastic bandage that would provide support without restricting movement. As she worked, she monitored the radio traffic that continued to paint a picture of deteriorating conditions around the main convoy. "Meridian Control, enemy forces are massing for what looks like a final assault on our position. We need immediate support. Control, this is air support. We're 2 minutes out, but we need target designation. Can you mark enemy positions?" "Air support, negative on target marking. Enemy forces are too close to civilian positions. We can't risk close air support at this time." The pilots were being cautious, and rightly so. But their caution meant that the main rescue force would have to hold their position, without air cover while enemy forces prepared for a coordinated assault. Time was running out for everyone trapped in the valley. Deanna finished treating Hassan's ankle and gathered the children around her. "We're going to move a little faster now," she told them. "It's going to be harder, but we're getting close to where the other soldiers are waiting." What she didn't tell them was that the next phase of their route would take them across open ground that was visible from enemy positions. She had identified a window of opportunity, a narrow ravine that would provide concealment for most of the crossing, but they would be exposed for approximately 50 meters while moving between cover points. 50 meters of exposure in an active combat zone. With 6 children who couldn't move fast enough to avoid aimed fire if they were spotted, she led them to the edge of the concealed area and studied the open ground they would have to cross. The ravine she had identified was exactly where her terrain analysis had predicted it would be, running roughly parallel to their intended direction of travel. But between their current position and the ravine entrance lay a slope of loose shale that would be difficult to cross quickly and impossible to cross silently. More concerning was the enemy activity she could observe in the area. 2 separate groups of fighters were moving through positions that would give them partial observation of the crossing point. They weren't specifically watching for her group. Their attention was focused on the main battle, but any movement in the open would draw their notice. Diana made a decision that violated every principle of tactical movement she had ever been taught. Instead of waiting for the enemy forces to move away from the area, she would create a distraction that would draw their attention in a different direction. She gathered several rocks and threw them toward a position approximately 200 meters from their intended crossing point. The rocks clattered down a steep slope, creating exactly the kind of noise that would suggest someone moving carelessly through the terrain. Both enemy groups immediately shifted their attention and their weapons toward the sound. "Now," she whispered to the children. Fast and quiet, they moved across the open ground like shadows, Amira leading the younger children while Diana brought up the rear with her weapon ready. The loose shale shifted under their feet, but the ambient noise of distant combat masked the small sounds they couldn't avoid making. 50 meters had never felt so far. Hassan stumbled on his injured ankle halfway across the open area. The sound of his fall seemed impossibly loud in the context of their desperate need for stealth. Deanna froze, watching the enemy positions for any sign that they had been detected. One of the fighters raised his head and scanned in their direction. For a moment that lasted forever, Deanna stared at him across 200 meters of rocky terrain, her finger on her weapon's trigger, calculating whether she could neutralize the threat before he could alert his companions. Then a mortar round exploded near the main convoy, and the fighter's attention snapped back toward the primary battle. He shouted something to his companions and began moving toward the sound of the explosions. They reached the ravine entrance without further incident, but Diana knew their luck wouldn't hold indefinitely. The enemy forces were becoming more active, more organized, and more systematic in their search patterns. The window for moving undetected was closing rapidly. The ravine provided excellent concealment, but presented new challenges. It was deeper than she had anticipated, with sections where the walls rose nearly vertical for 12 feet on either side. The children would need help negotiating some of the obstacles, and helping them would slow their progress significantly, but it also offered something she hadn't expected. Evidence of other people using this route recently. Fresh footprints in the sandy bottom of the ravine, moving in the same direction they were traveling. Boot prints that looked military in origin, accompanied by smaller prints that could belong to civilians. Someone else had found this route and used it to move toward the defensive position where Walsh was coordinating the main rescue effort. The realization hit her like cold water. Morrison's team hadn't been completely unsuccessful. They had managed to extract some people from the combat zone, and they had used the same terrain analysis that had led Diana to this route. She followed the tracks through the ravine system, using them as confirmation that her route selection was accurate while remaining alert for any signs that the route might be compromised. The tracks were several hours old, which suggested that whoever had made them had passed through during the early stages of the attack. 20 minutes later, she heard voices ahead, English voices, speaking in the controlled tones of soldiers. Managing a difficult situation. Perimeter security is set, but we can't hold this position indefinitely. Enemy forces are probing our flanks. A medical station is set up behind the rocks. We can handle casualties, but we need evacuation soon. Has anyone heard from Crawford? She was supposed to be confined to quarters. Walsh's voice, carrying clearly through the rocky terrain. Crawford's out here somewhere. I heard her on the radio earlier, but she's not responding now. Deanna keyed her radio to Walsh's frequency. Walsh, this is Crawford. I'm approaching your position from the southeast with 6 children. Don't shoot me. The response was immediate and filled with relief. Crawford. Jesus, where have you been? We've had people looking for you. I've been collecting lost sheep. I'm about 200 meters from your position, moving through the ravine system. I need you to have medical support standing by one of the children. Has an injured ankle, and they're all suffering from dehydration and exposure. Copy that. We'll be ready for you. Deanna turned to the children, who had been listening to the radio conversation with expressions of growing hope. You hear that? We're almost there. Just a little bit further, and you'll be with the other soldiers who will keep you safe. Amira smiled and translated for the younger children, who responded with the first genuine expressions of joy Diana had seen since finding them. The baby woke up and made gurgling sounds that almost sounded like laughter. Even Hassan managed a grin despite his injured ankle. The final approach to the defensive position required them to cross one more section of open ground, but this time they would be moving toward friendly forces rather than away from enemy positions. Deanna could see soldiers positioned among the rocks ahead, their weapons oriented outward toward potential threats, but their body language suggesting controlled confidence rather than desperate defense. Walsh appeared at the edge of the defensive perimeter as they approached, his face breaking into a grin when he saw the children following Diana through the rocks. Well, I'll be damned, he said. You actually did it. We're not safe yet, Deanna replied, but she was smiling too. How many others have you managed to extract? 41 civilians plus most of our security team. Morrison's people got here about an hour ago with the first group. We've got good defensive positions and medical support, but we're still waiting for extraction. As they entered the perimeter, Deanna felt the kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical exertion, but from the release of sustained tension. The children were safe, surrounded by soldiers who would protect them and medical personnel who could treat their injuries. The immediate crisis was over, but even as medics began examining the children and offering them food and water, Diana could hear the ongoing radio traffic that indicated the larger battle was still raging. The convoy vehicles were still under fire. Air support was having difficulty identifying targets, and enemy forces were continuing to mass for what intelligence suggested would be a final assault. Walsh joined her at the edge of the defensive perimeter, where they could observe the valley floor below. Smoke rose from multiple locations, and the sound of gunfire had intensified rather than diminished. Crawford, Walsh said quietly, what you did out there, that was something special. Those kids would be dead if you hadn't gone after them. They're not home yet, Deanna replied. None of us are. As if to emphasize her point, a new series of explosions echoed across the valley. Enemy forces were escalating their assault, bringing heavier weapons to bear on the remaining defenders. The defensive position where they had found temporary safety was strong, but it wasn't invulnerable. And somewhere in the valley below, The final phase of the battle was about to begin. At 3:42 a.m., the final assault began with a sound like the world tearing apart. Enemy forces had spent the previous 6 hours methodically positioning heavy weapons in the hills, surrounding the defensive perimeter where Deanna Crawford and the rescued civilians waited for extraction. What had started as an ambush on a convoy had evolved into a coordinated siege, with multiple enemy units converging on the position where American forces had concentrated their rescue efforts. Diana, crouched behind a boulder formation with Amira pressed against her side, the 8-year-old girl's small hand gripping her sleeve with desperate intensity. Around them, 47 other civilians huddled in whatever cover they could find while American soldiers prepared for what everyone knew would be the decisive engagement of the battle. The first rocket-propelled grenade struck the northern perimeter at precisely 3:42 a.m., followed by sustained automatic weapons fire from multiple directions. The defensive position that had seemed secure in daylight revealed its vulnerabilities in the harsh illumination of muzzle flashes and exploding ordnance. Walsh appeared beside Deanna's position, his face grim in the flickering light of distant explosions. "They're hitting us from 4 directions," he shouted over the noise of incoming fire. "We've got good cover, but they're bringing up heavy weapons that can punch through our positions. What about air support?" "Still 20 minutes. Out. Apparently, there's weather moving in that's grounding close air support aircraft. 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. The enemy assault was intensifying with each passing moment, and Diana could hear the distinctive sound of mortar rounds being dropped into tubes somewhere in the surrounding hills. In 60 seconds, those rounds would begin falling on their position with mathematical precision. She studied the tactical situation with the analytical mind that had made her such an effective intelligence analyst. The enemy had positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of fire that would make movement in any direction suicidal. But they had also committed to a frontal assault that would require them to advance across open ground to achieve their final objectives. That advance would make them vulnerable to the same kind of defensive fire they were currently delivering, but only if the defenders had sufficient ammunition and defensive positions to sustain a prolonged engagement. "Walsh," she said, "how are we on ammunition?" "Getting low. We were loaded for a rescue operation, not a siege." The first mortar rounds began falling 30 seconds later, walking across the defensive perimeter with devastating accuracy. Deanna pulled Amira closer and covered the child's body with her own as debris rained down around them. The other children were scattered throughout the perimeter, each protected by whatever soldiers could be spared from the defensive line, but protection was becoming increasingly theoretical. The enemy had obviously studied this position in advance, probably during the same reconnaissance that had allowed them to plan the original convoy ambush. They knew exactly where the defensive strong points were located, and they were systematically destroying them. Lieutenant Morrison appeared through the smoke and chaos, his earlier confidence replaced by the grim determination of someone who had learned more about combat in the past 12 hours than in his Hassan stumbled on his injured ankle halfway across the open area. The sound of his fall seemed impossibly loud in the context of their desperate need for stealth. Deanna froze, watching the enemy positions for any sign that they had been detected. One of the fighters raised his head and scanned in their direction. For a moment that lasted forever, Deanna stared at him across 200 meters of rocky terrain, her finger on her weapon's trigger, calculating whether she could neutralize the threat before he could alert his companions. Then a mortar round exploded near the main convoy, and the fighter's attention snapped back toward the primary battle. He shouted something to his companions and began moving toward the sound of the explosions. They reached the ravine entrance without further incident, but Diana knew their luck wouldn't hold indefinitely. The enemy forces were becoming more active, more organized, and more systematic in their search patterns. The window for moving undetected was closing rapidly, The ravine provided excellent concealment, but presented new challenges. It was deeper than she had anticipated, with sections where the walls rose nearly vertical for 12 feet on either side. The children would need help negotiating some of the obstacles, and helping them would slow their progress significantly, but it also offered something she hadn't expected. Evidence of other people using this route recently. Fresh footprints in the sandy bottom of the ravine, moving in the same direction they were traveling. Boot prints that looked military in origin, accompanied by smaller prints that could belong to civilians. Someone else had found this route and used it to move toward the defensive position where Walsh was coordinating the main rescue effort. The realization hit her like cold water. Morrison's team hadn't been completely unsuccessful. They had managed to extract some people from the combat zone, and they had used the same terrain analysis that had led Diana to this route. She followed the tracks through the ravine system, using them as confirmation that her route selection was accurate while remaining alert for any signs that the route might be compromised. The tracks were several hours old, which suggested that whoever had made them had passed through during the early stages of the attack. 20 minutes later, she heard voices ahead, English voices, speaking in the controlled tones of soldiers. Managing a difficult situation. Perimeter security is set, but we can't hold this position indefinitely. Enemy forces are probing our flanks. A medical station is set up behind the rocks. We can handle casualties, but we need evacuation soon. Has anyone heard from Crawford? She was supposed to be confined to quarters. Walsh's voice, carrying clearly through the rocky terrain. Crawford's out here somewhere. I heard her on the radio earlier, but she's not responding now. Deanna keyed her radio to Walsh's frequency. Walsh, this is Crawford. I'm approaching your position from the southeast with 6 children. Don't shoot me. The response was immediate and filled with relief. Crawford. Jesus, where have you been? We've had people looking for you. I've been collecting lost sheep. I'm about 200 meters from your position, moving through the ravine system. I need you to have medical support standing by one of the children. Has an injured ankle, and they're all suffering from dehydration and exposure. Copy that. We'll be ready for you. Diana turned to the children, who had been listening to the radio conversation with expressions of growing hope. You hear that? We're almost there. Just a little bit further, and you'll be with the other soldiers who will keep you safe. Amira smiled and translated for the younger children, who responded with the first genuine expressions of joy Diana had seen since finding them. The baby woke up and made gurgling sounds that almost sounded like laughter. Even Hassan managed a grin despite his injured ankle. The final approach to the defensive position required them to cross one more section of open ground, but this time they would be moving toward friendly forces rather than away from enemy positions. Diana could see soldiers positioned among the rocks ahead, their weapons oriented outward toward potential threats, but their body language suggesting controlled confidence rather than desperate defense. Walsh appeared at the edge of the defensive perimeter as they approached, his face breaking into a grin when he saw the children following Diana through the rocks. Well, I'll be damned, he said. You actually did it. We're not safe yet, Diana replied, but she was smiling too. How many others have you managed to extract? 41 civilians plus most of our security team. Morrison's people got here about an hour ago with the first group. We've got good defensive positions and medical support, but we're still waiting for extraction. As they entered the perimeter, Deanna felt the kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical exertion, but from the release of sustained tension. The children were safe, surrounded by soldiers who would protect them and medical personnel who could treat their injuries. The immediate crisis was over, but even as medics began examining the children and offering them food and water, Diana could hear the ongoing radio traffic that indicated the larger battle was still raging. The convoy vehicles were still under fire. Air support was having difficulty identifying targets, and enemy forces were continuing to mass for what intelligence suggested would be a final assault. Walsh joined her at the edge of the defensive perimeter, where they could observe the valley floor below. Smoke rose from multiple locations, and the sound of gunfire had intensified rather than diminished. "Crawford," Walsh said quietly, "what you did out there, that was something special. Those kids would be dead if you hadn't gone after them." "They're not home yet," Deanna replied. "None of us are." As if to emphasize her point, a new series of explosions echoed across the valley. Enemy forces were escalating their assault, bringing heavier weapons to bear on the remaining defenders. The defensive position where they had found temporary safety was strong, but it wasn't invulnerable. And somewhere in the valley below, the final phase of the battle was about to begin. At 3:42 a.m., the final assault began with a sound like the world tearing apart. Enemy forces had spent the previous 6 hours methodically positioning heavy weapons in the hills, surrounding the defensive perimeter where Deanna Crawford and the rescued civilians waited for extraction. What had started as an ambush on a convoy had evolved into a coordinated siege, with multiple enemy units converging on the position where American forces had concentrated their rescue efforts. Diana, crouched behind a boulder formation with Amira pressed against her side, the 8-year-old girl's small hand gripping her sleeve with desperate intensity. Around them, 47 other civilians huddled in whatever cover they could find while American soldiers prepared for what everyone knew would be the decisive engagement of the battle. The first rocket-propelled grenades struck the northern perimeter at precisely 3:42 a.m., followed by sustained automatic weapons fire from multiple directions. The defensive position that had seemed secure in daylight revealed its vulnerabilities in the harsh illumination of muzzle flashes and exploding ordnance. Walsh appeared beside Diana's position, his face grim in the flickering light of distant explosions. "They're hitting us from 4 directions," he shouted over the noise of incoming fire. "We've got good cover, but they're bringing up heavy weapons that can punch through our positions." "What about air support? Still 20 minutes out." "Apparently. There's weather moving in that's grounding close air support aircraft. 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. The enemy assault was intensifying with each passing moment, and Diana could hear the distinctive sound of mortar rounds being dropped into tubes somewhere in the surrounding hills. In 60 seconds, those rounds would begin falling on their position with mathematical precision. She studied the tactical situation with the analytical mind that had made her such an effective intelligence analyst. The enemy had positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of fire that would make movement in any direction suicidal. But they had also committed to a frontal assault that would require them to advance across open ground to achieve their final objectives. That advance would make them vulnerable to the same kind of defensive fire they were currently delivering, but only if the defenders had sufficient ammunition and defensive positions to sustain a prolonged engagement. "Walsh," she said, "how are we on ammunition? Getting low." "We were loaded for a rescue operation, not a siege." The first mortar rounds began falling 30 seconds later, walking across the defensive perimeter with devastating accuracy. Deanna pulled Amira closer and covered the child's body with her own as debris rained down around them. The other children were scattered throughout the perimeter, each protected by whatever soldiers could be spared from the defensive line. But protection was becoming increasingly theoretical. The enemy had obviously studied this position in advance, probably during the same reconnaissance that had allowed them to plan the original convoy ambush. They knew exactly where the defensive strong points were located, and they were systematically destroying them. Entire previous military career. "Crawford," he shouted, "we need to move the civilians to the secondary position. This location is going to be overrun." Deanna looked toward the secondary position, a cluster of rocks approximately 200 meters to the east. It offered better cover from the current enemy assault, but it would require moving 50 people. across open ground under direct fire. How many can we move at once? Maybe 10, if we use smoke grenades for concealment. But we don't have enough smoke to cover multiple trips. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple. 50 people, 10 at a time, 5 separate movements across ground that was under enemy observation. Even if the first group made it safely, subsequent movements would face increasingly accurate fire as enemy forces adjusted their aim, but staying in the current position wasn't an option either. The next mortar barrage would be closer, more accurate, and more devastating than the first. Diana made a decision that she had been preparing for without realizing it since the moment she had sent that unauthorized message to Regional Command 12 hours earlier. "Morrison," she said, "take the children in the first group. Use all the smoke grenades you have. I'll provide covering fire and follow with the remaining civilians." "Crawford, that's an order, Lieutenant." Morrison stared at her with confusion. Intelligence analysts didn't give orders to infantry officers, especially not in combat situations. But something in Diana's voice, some quality of absolute certainty, made him nod and begin gathering the children. Amira looked up at Diana with eyes that seemed far too old for her 8-year-old face. "American soldier, you are coming with U.S.?" Diana knelt beside the girl and brushed dirt from her cheek. "I'll be right behind you. Stick close to the lieutenant and do exactly what he tells you to do." It wasn't exactly a lie. She would be right behind them, in the sense that she would be providing the covering fire that would keep them alive during their movement. But she had no intention of making the crossing herself. The secondary position could accommodate 40 people in defensible cover. It could not accommodate 50. Someone would have to stay behind to ensure that the movement succeeded, and that someone would not survive the experience. Walsh had reached the same conclusion. He appeared beside her position as Morrison began organizing the first group for movement. "Crawford," he said quietly, "I've been doing this for 12 years. This is my call, not yours." "Negative," she replied, checking her weapon and gathering additional ammunition from wounded soldiers who no longer needed it. "You're needed at the secondary position to coordinate the defense. I'm the one who got us into this situation. You're the one who saved those children. And now I'm going to make sure they stay saved." The first group moved out under cover of smoke grenades that created a dense gray cloud across the open ground. Diana watched Morrison lead the children through the artificial fog, his movement confident despite the sustained enemy fire that searched blindly through the concealment. They made it to the secondary position without casualties. The second group consisted of wounded civilians and the medical personnel treating them. This movement was slower, more vulnerable, but it succeeded because enemy forces were still adjusting to the new tactical situation. By the time the third group was ready to move, the enemy had adapted. Machine gun fire swept the crossing area with systematic precision, and mortar rounds began falling closer to the secondary position as enemy observers identified the new target. Diana moved to a firing position that provided the best possible field of fire across the enemy approach routes. She had 4 magazines of ammunition remaining, enough for perhaps 5 minutes of sustained fire. She would use those 5 minutes to ensure that the remaining civilians reached safety. The third group made it across, then the fourth. 23 people remained in the original position, including Diana and 5 soldiers who had volunteered to provide rear guard security. "Last group," Walsh called over the radio. "Crawford, you're in this one." "Negative, maintaining overwatch." "Crawford, that's a direct order." "Walsh," she replied, her voice calm despite the chaos around her, "take care of the children." She switched off her radio and focused on the tactical situation developing in front of her. Enemy forces were massing for a final assault on both positions, but they were concentrating their efforts on the secondary position where most of the civilians were now located. That left the original position temporarily less defended, but It also meant that anyone remaining here would face the full attention of enemy forces once the main assault began. The last group of civilians began their movement toward safety. Diana provided covering fire, her shots carefully aimed at enemy positions that were attempting to engage the moving targets. Her marksmanship training, developed over months of practice on the base firing range, proved effective in the chaos of combat. Enemy fighters dropped or sought cover as her precise fire forced them to abandon their shooting positions, but she was running out of ammunition. And enemy forces were beginning to realize that the covering fire was coming from a single position, manned by perhaps one or two people. They began converging on her location. Amira's voice crackled over the radio, speaking in accented English. American soldier, where are you?" Diana keyed her radio one last time. "I'm right here, Amira. You're safe now. Be brave just like you showed me." Then she turned off the radio permanently and prepared for the final phase of the engagement. Enemy forces approached her position from 3 directions, moving with the confidence of fighters who knew they faced minimal opposition. Diana had perhaps 30 rounds of ammunition remaining, enough to delay them, but not enough to stop them. She thought about the message she had sent to the regional command that morning, the action that had branded her as someone who couldn't be trusted to follow orders. She thought about Thompson's face when he realized his intelligence assessment had been wrong. She thought about Morrison learning more about leadership in 12 hours than most officers learned in years of peacetime service. But mostly, she thought about 6 children who were alive because someone had been willing to see threats that others dismissed, to act when action was unauthorized, and to pay whatever price was necessary to bring them home. The final assault lasted 17 minutes. When air support finally arrived, they found the secondary position intact, with 47 civilians and 12 American military personnel alive and defensible. The original position was silent, marked only by evidence of fierce fighting and the body of one intelligence analyst who had chosen duty over survival. Amira was found sitting beside the radio, pressing the transmit button and calling in accented English. "American soldier, please answer. American soldier, where are you?" The after-action report, filed 3 weeks later, described Operation Safeguard as a successful civilian evacuation that resulted in minimal casualties despite unexpected enemy activity. It noted that intelligence analyst Sergeant Diana Crawford had violated direct orders by leaving base without authorization, had interfered with ongoing military operations, and had engaged in unauthorized combat operations outside her designated role. The report recommended that she be posthumously reduced in rank and that her family be denied certain military benefits due to her insubordinate conduct during the operation. What the report didn't mention was that 47 people had gone home to their families because one woman had been willing to be wrong 46 times in order to be right when it mattered most. Amira kept Diana's field notebook, the one with hand-drawn maps and careful observations about cooking fires and livestock movements. She couldn't read the English writing, but she understood that the notebook belonged to the American soldier who had taught her to be brave. Years later, when she was old enough to understand what had happened in that valley, Amira would learn that some people called Diana Crawford a traitor who had died because she couldn't follow orders. But Amira would always know the truth. Diana Crawford had died protecting 50 civilians from enemy fire, not because she was a traitor, but because she was exactly the kind of soldier the world needed more of. The kind who counted cooking fires at dawn, who listened when others dismissed warnings, and who understood that sometimes being right once mattered more than being wrong 46 times. The kind who brought children home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.